In our last few videos, I showed you how to mark your fabric using stencils and how to continuously quilt a horizontal square grid. Now it's time to take a look at our next design. Hello, I'm Dorie Hruska with Forever Quilting, and welcome back to our free motion quilting challenge, Quilting on the Lines. In this free video series, you're going to learn how to continuously quilt 9 different grid designs, and I'll demonstrate how to quilt them on a domestic machine and a long arm machine. If you are just now joining us, you can find a link to the free pattern below, or you can use a solid piece of fabric to practice these designs on. You'll also find a list of the stencils and the rulers I'll be using. Throughout this challenge, I want you to focus on following a marked line. Sometimes that means you will be using a ruler to control your machine, and sometimes you'll be quilting free-handed. Either way, the techniques you learn here by practicing these designs will help you to improve your ability to machine quilt any design. And the best part is, you'll be learning to do it continuously. Now, if you've never used rulers before, be sure to check out the second video on quilting a square crosshatch grid, where I've given you several tips on setting up your machine. Before we get to the quilting, let's take a look at the travel path for this design. Straight line crosshatching on a square grid that is on point. We're going to work with a block that has 3 squares across and 3 squares down. The traveling path for crosshatching on point requires little to no backtracking, especially if the marked grid lines up perfectly with our block, like this one does. We're going to stitch in the ditch around the block to stabilize. For the final side, every time the grid intersects with the ditch, you'll pivot and stitch the next line, bouncing off of the ditch until you get back to where you started. Continue traveling up that last side. Quilt the crosshatch lines, bounce, bounce, bounce. Continue doing this until you've got all the crosshatch lines quilted. If you'll remember to bounce off the ditch, then you won't get lost. Now that was simple, right? Let's see how this looks when quilting on a domestic or a sit-down machine. Because I've already stitched in the ditch around this block, I'm going to start at one intersection that touches the ditch, and then I will travel through the ditch to move to the next set of lines. Using a grid that is on point is the most traditional form of crosshatching, and because we move our fabric when quilting on a domestic machine, it can feel the same as quilting a horizontal grid. To keep your lines straight, try using a long enough ruler so that you can line up the ruler with the end point, leaving a 1/4 inch space for the hopping foot. If you must use a shorter ruler, then line up the ruler from one intersection to another, pausing when you come to the next intersection before moving your hands. Sometimes quilting vertically is easier, unless you're trying to follow a line that's behind the hopping foot. Then I prefer to move the fabric to where I'm quilting at the diagonal, to where I can see my end point to be able to line up my ruler. Remember to take your time as you're lining up the ruler. You want to make sure that you keep the fabric flat underneath the ruler so that you don't get any pleats. Even though my quilted lines did not stay on the marked lines, because I kept the lines straight, it won't be noticeable once the marked lines are gone. Now let's look at quilting on a long arm machine. On a long arm machine, you may find quilting an on-point grid to be a little challenging, as you learn to control the ruler and machine while quilting on the diagonal.
Remember to take it slow. Pause where the lines intersect to reposition your hand. Focus on keeping the lines straight. Quilt the diagonal line until you run into the ditch. Bounce off of the ditch to change directions. You will use the same travel path if you are quilting crosshatching behind or around applique. When your crosshatch lines run into the applique, bounce off to change directions, or travel around the applique until you come to the next marked line, then continue crosshatching.
I know I've said it before, but crosshatching on point is my favorite. I'm not sure what it is about this traditional design that makes me so happy. It complements so many other quilting motifs, especially when it's up against a curved design like a feather or a curl. It's great on panels, around applique, and even in sashing and borders. Now, last time I mentioned how my Making Connection book will teach you how to plan out the continuous quilting path to fill in your blocks. Well, it also teaches you how to fill in the grids that are on point, like in sashing and borders. This book is such a great resource and one that every quilter should have in their library. I hope you will come back next time when we'll work on another grid, but this time at a slightly different angle.